The scar that ran from Elijah Harmon's left temple to his jaw had been carved there by a Comanche blade when he was 17, and in the 12 years since, no woman had ever looked at him without flinching. Until her, Fort Lyon, Colorado, 1878. The trading post sat on the edge of civilization, where the Arkansas River cut through land that belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it. Elijah had ridden in that September morning with 3 wild mustangs he'd broken himself, his leather duster stained with trail dust and his eyes scanning the settlement out of habit. Trust was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The scar made people nervous. The 2 Colt revolvers at his hips made them downright cautious. He'd grown accustomed to the sideways glances, the mothers pulling their daughters close when he passed, the whispers that followed him like tumbleweeds in the wind. He was tying his horses outside the general store when he heard the crash inside, followed by a man's angry voice. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he forced himself to pause. Not his business. Never get involved. That was how you stayed alive out here. But then he heard her voice, clear and steady despite the fear that should have been there. I said no, Mr. Patterson. I've told you 3 times now, and my answer remains the same. Something in that voice made Elijah push through the door. The scene inside was exactly what he'd expected. A red-faced man in an expensive suit had a young woman backed against the counter, his bulk blocking her escape. The shopkeeper stood frozen behind his register, clearly unwilling to intervene. The woman was maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair pinned up in a simple style and a calico dress that had seen better days. Her chin was raised, her green eyes defiant even as Patterson's hand gripped her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You'll change your tune when your aunt's debts come due," Patterson was saying. "Marry me and I'll forgive everything she owes. Otherwise, I'll take that homestead and everything on it." "The homestead is mine," she said through gritted teeth. "My aunt left it to me, not to her creditors." "Legal papers say otherwise, sweetheart." Elijah cleared his throat. 3 heads turned toward him. The shopkeeper looked relieved. Patterson looked annoyed. And the woman looked at him without a single trace of fear in those green eyes, even with the scar running down his face like a canyon carved by violence. She looked at him like he was just a man who'd walked into a store. That simple, unremarkable glance hit him harder than any bullet ever had. "Lady seems to have given you her answer," Elijah said quietly. His voice had the rough quality of someone who didn't use it often. Patterson sized him up, taking in the guns and the scar and the 6 feet of lean muscle that came from breaking horses and sleeping on hard ground. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. I'm making it concern me." The woman pulled her wrist free while Patterson's attention was divided. She stepped away from him, moving closer to Elijah without seeming to realize it. Patterson's eyes followed her, his jaw working with barely contained rage. "You know who I am?" Patterson demanded. "Can't say I care," Elijah replied. "I own half this town, the bank, the hotel, the saloon. That homestead she's sitting on should have been mine months ago. Sounds like a legal matter. Should probably take it up with a judge instead of cornering women in stores." Patterson's hand moved toward his coat, but he wasn't a fast man and Elijah was already watching for it. The Colt was in Elijah's hand before Patterson's fingers found his derringer, not pointed at anyone but present enough to end the conversation. "I'd suggest you leave the lady alone," Elijah said softly. "Go on back to your bank or your hotel or wherever you spend your days counting money." For a moment, the air in the store was tight as a drumskin. Then Patterson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You just made a mistake, friend. A big one." He adjusted his coat and walked toward the door, pausing to look back at the woman. "You've got until the end of the month, Miss Vaughn." Then the law comes for what's mine." The door slammed behind him. Elijah holstered his gun and turned to find the woman studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Most people looked away from the scar after the first glance. She didn't. "Thank you," she said. "Though I'm not sure you did either of us any favors. Thomas Patterson doesn't forgive slights. You got family here, someone who can help with this debt situation." She shook her head. "My aunt raised me after my parents died of cholera when I was 8. She passed this spring. It's just me now." She paused, then extended her hand like she was greeting him at a church social instead of in the aftermath of a confrontation. "Josephine Vaughn." He looked at her hand for a moment, surprised by the gesture. His hands were scarred and calloused, hardly fit to touch someone like her. But she waited, patient and unwavering, so he took her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm roughened by work. "Elijah Harmon, you're new to Fort Lyon. Just passing through, need to sell these horses and resupply." Something flickered in her eyes, disappointment maybe, but she nodded. "Well, thank you again, Mr. Harmon. I should get my supplies and head back to my homestead before Patterson decides to cause more trouble." Elijah watched her gather the few items she'd come for, noting how she counted out coins carefully, clearly watching every penny. The shopkeeper, a nervous man named Wilson, kept glancing between them like he expected more trouble to come crashing through his door. "Miss Vaughn," Elijah found himself saying, "you riding back alone? I have my aunt's mare outside." "How far?" "About 5 miles northwest, following the river." "I'll ride with you. Make sure you get there safe." She turned to him, and again there was that direct gaze searching his face without flinching at what she found there. "You don't have to do that. I know." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that didn't require words. She nodded once, and they walked out together into the afternoon sun. Her mare was a sturdy paint, well cared for despite showing some age. Elijah untied one of his mustangs, a black gelding with good bones and a steady temperament. They rode in silence at first, following the well-worn trail that paralleled the Arkansas River. The cottonwoods along the banks were just starting to turn gold, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. The land here was different from the desert country Elijah had grown up in, greener and more forgiving, though the mountains in the distance reminded him that winter came hard and fast this far north. "How'd you get that scar?" Josephine asked suddenly. She wasn't looking at him, her eyes on the trail ahead, but he could tell the question was genuine curiosity rather than morbid fascination. Most people either stared or pretended it didn't exist. No one ever just asked. "Comanche raid. I was 17, traveling with a wagon train. They hit us at dawn, ran off most of the livestock. I tried to stop one from taking my father's horse. He was faster with a knife than I expected." "Did you lose anyone?" "My father took an arrow defending the women and children." The old pain was still there, but time had worn it smooth like river stones. "What about you? How'd you end up out here?" "My aunt homesteaded this land right after the war. She was a widow, wanted a fresh start, sent for me when I was 8. We built a life here together, just the two of us." Her voice softened. "She taught me everything, how to shoot, how to work the land, how to survive. I thought we'd have more time. The debt Patterson mentioned is real." She nodded slowly. "Aunt Clara borrowed money from his bank 3 years ago when the crops failed. We've been paying it back, but after she died, he claimed there's more owed than what the records show. I think he's lying, but I can't prove it, and he's decided he wants the land more than he wants the money." She glanced at him. "Or maybe he wants both. You turned down his proposal." "I'd rather lose everything than marry that man." The steel in her voice matched the set of her jaw. "I've worked that land for 14 years. Every fence post, every crop, every improvement. It's mine by right and by deed. He won't take it from me without a fight. Elijah respected that. Too many people rolled over when powerful men came calling. What's your plan? Honestly, I don't have one yet. I've been trying to scrape together enough to pay off what I actually owe, but Patterson keeps adding interest and fees. It's a rigged game. She pulled her mare to a stop and pointed ahead. That's home. The homestead sat in a bend of the river, protected on three sides by cottonwoods and with a clear view of the approach from the south. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone chimney and glass windows that spoke of prosperity, at least by frontier standards. There was a good-sized barn, a chicken coop, and fields that showed the remnants of what had been a decent harvest. A vegetable garden near the house was still producing, autumn squash heavy on the vine. "You built all this?" Elijah asked. "Most of it. Aunt Clara hired help for the cabin and barn, but the rest we did ourselves." Pride colored her voice. "It's not much, but it's honest work." They rode up to the barn, and Elijah helped her unsaddle the mare before tending to his own horse. The barn was clean and organized, everything in its place. The kind of order that came from discipline and necessity. As they worked, Elijah found himself watching her move, noting the capable way she handled the tack, the automatic check she did of her horse's hooves and legs. She knew what she was doing. "You're welcome to stay for supper," Josephine said as they walked toward the cabin. "It's the least I can do after you helped me today." Elijah should have said no. Should have ridden back to Fort Lyon, sold his horses, and moved on like he always did. But something about this woman and her stubborn courage made him want to stay, at least for a little while. Besides, leaving her alone with Patterson making threats didn't sit right. "Appreciate that," he said. The inside of the cabin matched the outside. Simple, clean, and well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with cooking pots hanging from iron hooks. There was a table with two chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, and a bed in the corner with a quilt that looked handmade. A ladder led to a small loft. Josephine immediately set about building up the fire and preparing food, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done these tasks thousands of times. "Tell me about the horses you're selling," she said as she worked. "I saw them outside the store. They looked half wild." "They were fully wild until I got hold of them. Caught them up in the mountains 3 weeks ago. Took some time to gentle them enough to sell, but they're good animals. Strong, smart, good wind." He paused. "Why? Just curious. I've always been interested in horses. Aunt Clara taught me to ride almost before I could walk. We used to have more, but I had to sell them after she died to pay some of the debt." They fell into a comfortable conversation while she cooked, talking about horses and land and the changing seasons. Elijah found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around people. Josephine didn't pry, didn't push, just let the conversation flow naturally, and she never once looked at him with fear or disgust. She looked at him like he was normal, like the scar was just a part of his face and nothing more. Supper was simple but good. Cornbread, beans flavored with salt pork, and the last tomatoes from her garden. They ate at the small table, and Elijah couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a meal with someone like this, peaceful and domestic. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have company that didn't set his teeth on edge. "Can I ask you something?" Josephine said, setting down her fork. "Go ahead." "Why did you help me today? You said you're just passing through. Most men would have kept walking." Elijah considered the question. He could have given her a dozen easy answers, but something about her directness deserved honesty in return. "I didn't like seeing him corner you. Didn't seem right, and—" He hesitated. "You looked at me like I was human. Most people don't." Her eyes softened. "That's because you are human. The scar is just a scar. Not everyone sees it that way. "Then they're fools." She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the simplest truth in the world. "You're the first person in this town who's helped me without wanting something in return. That makes you better than most." The words settled something in Elijah's chest. A knot he didn't know was there coming loose. They finished eating in companionable silence, and afterward, Josephine insisted he take the bed while she climbed to the loft. He argued, but she was stubborn as a mule, and eventually he gave in. Lying in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her settling in above him, Elijah made a decision. He'd been drifting for 12 years, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, always moving to the next job, the next town, the next horizon. But something about Josephine Vaughn and her quiet bravery made him want to stop running. She needed help, and he found that he wanted to be the one to give it. In the morning, he'd make her an offer. He'd help her deal with Patterson and the debt, help her hold onto her land. And if she agreed, maybe he'd stay a while longer, see where this unfamiliar feeling in his chest led him. It had been a long time since Elijah had felt anything like hope, but as he drifted off to sleep in Josephine Vaughn's cabin, that's exactly what was blooming in his heart. The sun was barely up when Elijah woke to find Josephine already at the stove, making coffee. The smell filled the cabin, rich and inviting. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, and she glanced over with a small smile. "Morning. Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," he admitted. "You didn't have to let me take the bed. I'm used to the loft. Besides, you're taller than me. Your feet would have been hanging off the edge up there." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to him. "I was thinking about what you asked yesterday, about my plan." Elijah took the coffee gratefully. "And I don't have one, not a good one anyway. I've been trying to come up with something for weeks, but I keep running into the same wall. Patterson has the law on his side, or at least he's bought enough of it to make my life difficult, and fighting him means money I don't have." She sat in the rocking chair, cradling her cup. "I think I'm going to lose the homestead, Mr. Harmon. I've been trying not to accept it, but I don't see a way out." "Elijah," he said. "Call me Elijah. And what if I told you I might have an idea?" Her eyes lifted to his, cautious hope flickering there. "I'm listening." "I sell those 3 horses, that's good money. Not enough to pay off the debt, probably, but enough to make a dent. And I'm good with my hands, good with building and fixing. I could help you improve the place, make it more valuable, maybe enough to refinance somewhere else." He set down his cup. "But more than that, Patterson strikes me as the kind of man who backs down when someone stands up to him. He's a bully. Bullies don't like it when their targets have protection. You're offering to stay for a while, until we figure this out." Josephine was quiet for a long moment, studying him over the rim of her cup. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. You could sell those horses and ride out today, never think about Fort Lyon or me again." "Could," he agreed, "but I won't. Something my father told me before he died. Good people are rare in this world, and when you find them, you hold on. You're good people, Josephine, I can see that, and you need help. Seems simple enough to me." "What do you get out of it?" The question was fair. Elijah thought about it, trying to put into words something he barely understood himself. "A place to stop, maybe. I've been moving for 12 years, never settling anywhere. Gets tiring after a while, and—" He met her eyes. "You don't look at me like I'm something to be afraid of." "That's worth more than you might think." She set down her cup and stood, crossing to where he sat on the edge of the bed. She extended her hand and he took it, feeling the same firm grip as yesterday. "Partners, then. We fight Patterson together and you can stay as long as you want." "Partners," he agreed. They shook on it, and Elijah felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening after being locked for years. This was different from anything he'd known before. This felt like the beginning of something that might actually matter. Over the next week, They fell into a routine. Elijah rode into Fort Lyon and sold 2 of his horses to a rancher looking for good stock, keeping the black gelding for himself. The money was better than he'd expected, enough to make Josephine's eyes widen when he brought it back and put it in her hands. "This is too much," she protested. "Those were your horses, your work. We're partners, remember? This goes toward the debt." He closed her fingers around the bills. "Besides, I've got another idea for making money. You said you know horses. What about breaking and training them for sale? There's always demand for good mounts, and we've got the space and the skills." Josephine's face lit up. "I used to do that with Aunt Clara. We stopped because it was just too much work for 2 women alone, but with you here." She grinned, and the expression transformed her face, made her look younger and more carefree. Yes, that could work. They started planning in earnest. Elijah would catch wild horses from the mountains, and they'd work together to break and train them. Josephine knew the local buyers, knew what they wanted and what they'd pay. With both of them working, they could build up a real business, something sustainable that would not only pay off the debt but give them a future. But Patterson wasn't idle. 2 days after Elijah moved his few belongings into the barn, giving Josephine her privacy while establishing his presence on the property, the banker sent his men out to the homestead. 3 of them rode up mid-morning while Elijah and Josephine were repairing a fence. The lead man was a hard-looking character with a crooked nose and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "Miss Vaughn, I'm Marshal Cobb. Mr. Patterson sent me out here to deliver a message." Josephine straightened, wiping dirt from her hands. Elijah moved closer to her, not threatening but present. "What message?" "Your payment is overdue. Mr. Patterson is prepared to foreclose unless you pay the full amount by the end of the month. That's 3 weeks from now. How much does he claim I owe?" Josephine asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. Cobb pulled out a piece of paper. $5,000 plus interest and fees. Total comes to $7,200. "That's impossible," Josephine said flatly. "The original loan was $3,000. I've been paying on it for 3 years. I should owe maybe half that by now." "Not according to the bank's records, madam. You've missed payments, incurred penalties, added interest. It's all documented, legal and proper." Cobb's eyes flicked to Elijah. "You the hired hand." "I'm her partner," Elijah said quietly. "Partner." Cobb's smile was unpleasant. "Mr. Patterson mentioned you, said you'd stuck your nose where it didn't belong. Might want to reconsider that, friend. Fort Lyon can be an unfriendly place for troublemakers." "Is that a threat, Marshal?" "Just friendly advice." Cobb folded the paper and handed it to Josephine. 3 weeks, Miss Vaughn. After that, this property becomes Mr. Patterson's and you'll need to vacate. Good day." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in their wake. Josephine stared at the paper in her hands, her face pale. $7,200. I don't have anywhere near that, even with the money from your horses." Elijah took the paper and read it carefully. The numbers were detailed, each charge itemized with dates and amounts. It looked official, but something about it smelled wrong. "This doesn't make sense. Look at these interest calculations. They're way higher than any legitimate bank would charge." "That's what I thought, but without proof of fraud, what can I do? Patterson owns the judge, owns the marshal. Even if I could prove he's lying, who would I take it to? There's got to be someone. A territorial judge, maybe, or a federal marshal." Josephine shook her head. "The nearest federal marshal is in Denver, over 100 miles away. And getting an appointment with a territorial judge could take months, time I don't have." They walked back to the cabin, both of them silent with frustration. Inside, Elijah spread the paper on the table and studied it again, looking for anything they could use. Josephine made coffee, her movements jerky with suppressed anger. I should have married him, she said suddenly, her voice bitter. At least then I'd still have my home, even if I had to share it with that snake. Don't say that, Elijah replied, looking up from the paper. You'd be miserable, and Patterson would still own you, just in a different way. But I'd have the land. Would you? Or would it be in his name, his property, with you just living on it at his pleasure? Men like Patterson don't share power, Josephine. They take and they keep taking until there's nothing left. He stood and crossed to her. We'll figure this out, I promise you that. She looked up at him, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Why do you care so much? You could still leave. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I decided to stay. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her shoulder. You're not alone anymore. Remember that. She let out a shaky breath and nodded. Then, to his surprise, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, her head against his chest. Elijah froze for a moment, uncertain, before carefully putting his arms around her in return. She was warm and solid in his embrace, and he could feel her heartbeat against his ribs. They stood like that for a long moment, taking comfort in each other's presence. When she finally pulled back, she wiped at her eyes quickly. Sorry, I don't usually fall apart like that. Nothing to apologize for. You're under a lot of pressure. We both are now. She managed a small smile. Thank you, Elijah, for staying, for helping, for being here. Nowhere else I'd rather be, he said, and realized he meant it completely. That evening they sat by the fire and talked strategy. They had 3 weeks to either pay off an impossible debt or find proof that Patterson was cheating. The first option seemed unlikely unless they got incredibly lucky with horse sales. The second required evidence they didn't have access to. What if we broke into the bank? Josephine suggested. Got the real records, compared them to what Patterson is claiming. That's illegal, and Patterson would have us arrested in a heartbeat. Besides, do you really think he keeps evidence of his fraud where it can be found? Man like that covers his tracks. Elijah poked at the fire with a stick. No, we need something else, something he won't expect. Like what? I don't know yet, but I'll think of something. Over the next few days, Elijah made trips into Fort Lyon, keeping his ears open and watching Patterson's operation. He learned that the banker had done this before, lending money to homesteaders, and then calling in inflated debts when he wanted their land. 3 families in the past 5 years had lost everything to Patterson's schemes. No one fought back because he had the law in his pocket and the money to make life hell for anyone who challenged him. But Elijah also learned something interesting. Patterson's operations weren't all above board. There were rumors of cattle rustling, of selling stolen livestock through legitimate channels, using his position to give criminals a way to profit. Nothing proven, all whispers and speculation, but where there was smoke there was usually fire. On his 4th visit to town, Elijah struck up a conversation with the blacksmith, a grizzled old man named Henry who'd been in Fort Lyon since before the war. Over drinks at the saloon, careful to keep things casual, Elijah steered the conversation toward Patterson. Man's a snake, Henry said, spitting tobacco juice into a spittoon. My boy worked for him at the bank for a while, kept the books. Quit last year, said he couldn't stomach what Patterson was doing, cooking numbers, charging illegal interest, foreclosing on people who'd paid up fair and square. Your boy still around? Nah, he headed to California, looking for better opportunities. But before he left, he told me something interesting. Said Patterson keeps 2 sets of books, one for show and one with the real numbers. The real ones in a safe in his office at the hotel, not at the bank where anyone official might look. Elijah's pulse quickened. Your boy ever see what was in that safe? He opened it a few times, running errands for Patterson. Said it wasn't just books in there. Legal documents, deeds, all sorts of papers that probably shouldn't exist. Henry squinted at him. Why you asking? You planning something foolish? Just curious. I've got a friend Patterson's been hassling. Miss Vaughn, I'd wager. That situation's a crying shame. Clara was a good woman, and Josephine's cut from the same cloth. Patterson's trying to steal what's rightfully hers. Henry leaned closer. You want my advice? Get her out of there. Take her somewhere safe before Patterson decides to take what he wants by force instead of pretending there's law involved. Appreciate the advice, but she's not the running type, and neither am I. Henry studied him for a long moment, taking in the scar and the steady eyes and the set of Elijah's jaw. You're planning to take him on, aren't you? That's dangerous thinking, son. Patterson's got men who'll kill for money, and he's got the law looking the other way. Sometimes dangerous is all you've got left. The old blacksmith shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper, writing something on it. This is my boy's address in Sacramento. You ever need someone to testify about what Patterson's been doing, you write to him. He'll come back if it means taking that snake down. Elijah took the paper, folding it carefully. Thank you, Henry. This might help. Just be careful. Patterson's killed before or had it done. No one can prove it, but everyone knows. Don't give him an excuse to add you and Miss Vaughn to that list. Riding back to the homestead, Elijah's mind raced. A second set of books in Patterson's hotel office. That was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. The problem was getting to it. Breaking into the hotel would be risky, probably impossible with Patterson's men around. But if they could somehow get access to that safe, get proof of the fraud, they might be able to take it to a federal marshal or a territorial authority, someone Patterson didn't control. He found Josephine working in the vegetable garden, harvesting the last of the autumn crops before the first frost came. She looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. You look like you've got news, she said. Maybe. Let's talk inside. Over coffee, he told her what Henry had shared. Josephine listened intently, her expression growing more focused as he spoke. When he finished, she sat back in her chair, thinking. So we need to get into Patterson's office at the hotel, she said. Any ideas how? A few, none of them good. The straightforward approach is a burglary, but that's risky and illegal. We get caught, we lose everything and probably end up in jail. What's the alternative? We convince someone with access to the office to help us. A maid, maybe, or someone who works at the hotel. That's still asking someone to break the law for us, and Patterson would destroy anyone who betrayed him. Josephine drummed her fingers on the table. What if we created a distraction? Something big enough to get Patterson and his men away from the hotel long enough for one of us to get in and out. Elijah considered it. That could work, but it would have to be something significant. Patterson's not going to leave that office unguarded for anything minor. They spent the evening brainstorming ideas, each one more elaborate than the last. Finally, as the fire burned low and the night grew late, Josephine said, What about a fire? Not a real one that would hurt anyone, but something that looks serious. The livery stable, maybe, or one of the warehouses. Everyone in town would respond to that, including Patterson's men. And while they're distracted, someone breaks into his office. Exactly. It was risky, but it might be their best shot. They refined the plan over the next few days, working out the details. Elijah would start the fake fire, using damp straw and green wood to create a lot of smoke but minimal actual danger. Josephine, who knew the hotel layout from deliveries she'd made in the past, would slip in through the back entrance and try to crack the safe. She'd practiced lockpicking with her aunt, a skill Clara had learned during her wild youth and passed down as a practical matter of survival. The night before they planned to execute the scheme, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll in the barn, staring at the darkness and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. They could get caught. Josephine could get hurt. Patterson could have them arrested or worse. But doing nothing meant losing the homestead for certain, and Elijah couldn't stand by and watch that happen. Around midnight, he heard the barn door creak open. Josephine stood there in her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a candle in her hand. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. "Too much thinking." She came in and sat on a hay bale near his bedroll. The candle cast flickering shadows across her face. "We don't have to do this, you know. I could just let it go, start over somewhere else." "Is that what you want?" "No," she said it firmly. "I want to fight. I want to win. I'm just scared." Being scared is smart, means you're thinking clearly about the risks. "Are you scared?" Elijah sat up, meeting her eyes. "Terrified, but I'm more scared of what happens if we do nothing. You deserve to keep your home, Josephine. And Patterson deserves to face consequences for what he's done, not just to you, but to everyone he's cheated over the years." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "If this goes wrong and something happens to me, promise you'll get out. Don't let Patterson destroy you too." "Nothing's going to happen to you. I won't let it." "You can't promise that. Watch me." He reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. Her hand was small in his, but strong. "We're going to pull this off, and then we're going to build something good here, together. That's the future I see when I close my eyes." Josephine squeezed his hand. "When did you become such an optimist?" "About a week ago, when a brave woman looked at me without fear and made me think maybe I could be more than a drifter with a scarred face." She leaned forward and kissed him then, a soft press of lips that lasted only a moment but felt like everything shifting into place. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "For luck," she whispered. "We'll make our own luck tomorrow night," he replied. She left the barn, taking the candle with her, and Elijah lay back down with his heart pounding. He touched his lips, remembering the gentle pressure, and smiled in the darkness. Whatever happened tomorrow, he knew one thing for certain. He was falling in love with Josephine Vaughn, and he'd do whatever it took to give them both a chance at a future together. The next evening, they rode into Fort Lyon separately, arriving from different directions to avoid suspicion. The plan was set for 10 o'clock, when the town would be settling down but not yet asleep. Elijah positioned himself near the livery stable at the edge of town, where he'd set up his fake fire. Josephine waited in an alley across from the hotel, her heart hammering against her ribs. At exactly 10 o'clock, Elijah struck a match. Within minutes, thick smoke was billowing from the stable, visible across half the town. Shouts of "fire" echoed through the streets, and people came running from every direction. Elijah joined the bucket brigade, helping to control the blaze while keeping an eye on the hotel. He saw Patterson emerge with 3 of his men, all of them heading toward the emergency. That was Josephine's signal. She slipped through the hotel's back entrance, moving quickly and quietly through the kitchen and up the servants' stairs to the second floor where Patterson kept his office. The door was locked, but she'd expected that. Her hands shook as she worked the picks, feeling for the tumblers. It seemed to take forever, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool evening air. Then, finally, the lock clicked open. Inside, the office was exactly as Henry had described. A large desk dominated the room, with filing cabinets along one wall and a portrait of Patterson himself hanging over the fireplace. And there, built into the wall behind the desk, was the safe. Josephine crossed to it, kneeling down and pressing her ear against the cool metal. This was the hard part. Cracking a safe was different from picking a door lock, requiring patience and a good ear. Her aunt had taught her the basics, but Josephine had never tried it on anything this important before. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to focus. Turned the dial slowly, listening for the telltale clicks that indicated the tumblers falling into place. First number found. Then the second. The third took longer, and she could hear voices in the street outside, people talking about the fire. How much time did she have? 5 minutes. 10. The third tumbler clicked into place. She turned the handle and the safe door swung open. Inside was exactly what they'd hoped for. Ledgers, documents, papers tied with string. Josephine grabbed everything she could carry, stuffing papers into the bag she'd brought. She took one of the ledgers, comparing it quickly to the official records Patterson had showed her. The differences were stark. According to his real books, she owed less than $800, not $7,200. He'd been inflating the debt systematically, adding false charges and interest that didn't exist. She grabbed proof of other frauds too. Documents showing Patterson had foreclosed on families who'd actually paid their debts, deeds to properties he'd obtained through questionable means. This wasn't just evidence against him for her case. This was enough to bring down his entire operation. Voices in the hallway made her freeze. People were coming back to the hotel. She had to move. Josephine closed the safe, spun the dial to hide what she'd done, and hurried to the door. She cracked it open, peering out. The hallway was empty. She slipped out, locked the door behind her, and made it to the servants' stairs just as she heard boots on the main staircase. Her heart was in her throat as she descended, clutching the bag to her chest. Through the kitchen, out the back door, into the alley. She didn't run, forced herself to walk normally despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. Only when she reached her horse, tied behind the general store, did she allow herself a moment to breathe. She'd done it. She actually had the evidence. Elijah found her 20 minutes later at their prearranged meeting spot, a grove of trees outside town. The fake fire had been contained quickly once people realized it wasn't serious, and suspicion had already been raised about how it started. They couldn't go back to the homestead yet in case Patterson sent men after them. Instead, they rode hard for 3 hours, putting distance between themselves and Fort Lyon. They made camp in a canyon, building a small, hidden fire. Josephine spread out the documents, and together they went through everything by firelight. The evidence was even better than they'd hoped. Patterson had been running his scheme for over a decade, and these books documented every fraudulent transaction. "This is enough," Elijah said, holding up one of the ledgers. "This is enough to put him away for years." "We need to get it to a federal marshal," Josephine said. "Someone Patterson can't bribe or threaten." "But Denver is over 100 miles away, and he'll know what we did as soon as he opens that safe. Then we ride for Denver tonight. Push the horses as hard as we dare and don't stop until we're standing in front of someone who can help." "What about the homestead?" "It'll still be there when we get back, and once Patterson's arrested, his claim on it dies with him." Elijah took her hand. "This is the only way, Josephine. We see this through to the end." She nodded, squeezing his fingers. "Together, together." They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horses and catch a few hours of sleep. The weather turned as they climbed into the higher elevations, rain soaking through their clothes and making the trail treacherous. But they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that every hour counted. 3 days later, exhausted and filthy, they arrived in Denver. The city was bigger than anything Josephine had ever seen, a sprawling collection of buildings and people that made Fort Lyon look like a ghost town by comparison. Elijah asked around until they found the federal marshal's office, a sturdy brick building near the courthouse. Marshal William Grant was a stern man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much corruption. He listened to their story with growing interest, examining the documents they'd brought with increasing focus. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "You two have any idea how much trouble you're in?" he asked. Josephine's heart sank. "We know we broke into his office, but we had no choice. He was stealing from me from dozens of people. We needed proof." "Oh, I'm not talking about that," Grant said, surprising them both. "I'm talking about the trouble you've stirred up for yourselves with Thomas Patterson. Man like that doesn't take kindly to being exposed. He'll come after you with everything he's got." "Can you help us?" Elijah asked. Grant leaned forward, tapping the ledger on his desk. "With evidence like this? Absolutely. I've been trying to build a case against Patterson for 2 years, but I could never get anyone to testify, never had concrete proof. This changes everything." He looked at them seriously. "But you need to understand what you're signing up for. There'll be a trial. You'll have to testify. Patterson will try to destroy your credibility, maybe try to hurt you directly, and it could take months to work through the legal system." "I don't care how long it takes," Josephine said firmly. "He tried to steal my home, my future. I want him to answer for that." "And you?" Grant asked Elijah. "You're just the hired help according to the paperwork. You could walk away from this right now." "I'm her partner," Elijah said, echoing the words he'd used with Marshal Cobb. "And I'm not going anywhere." Grant smiled for the first time. "Good. Then let's get started. I'm going to send deputies to Fort Lyon to arrest Patterson and secure the bank's records. You two will stay here in Denver under protective custody until the trial. I've got a safe house where you can wait." The safe house turned out to be a modest hotel on the outskirts of Denver, with 2 federal deputies stationed outside at all times. For the first few days, Elijah and Josephine did nothing but sleep, their bodies finally catching up with everything they'd been through. Then, as their strength returned, they began to plan for what came next. "When this is over, I want to expand the horse business," Josephine said one evening as they sat in the hotel's small parlor. "Really build it into something substantial. We could hire help, breed our own stock, maybe even start training for specific purposes. Cavalry horses, ranch horses, racing stock. That takes capital," Elijah pointed out. "I know. But with Patterson gone, I can take out legitimate loans, maybe partner with other ranchers. Build something real." She looked at him. "With you if you want, as real partners, equal stakes in everything." Elijah's throat tightened. "You do that, make me a full partner. You've earned it. More than that, I trust you and I." She hesitated, then pushed forward. "I've come to care for you, Elijah. More than I probably should given how little time we've known each other. But you've changed my life. Saved it, really. I can't imagine going forward without you beside me." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "I've been alone for 12 years, Josephine. Moving from place to place, never letting anyone get close because I thought this scar made me someone worth avoiding. Then you looked at me without fear and everything changed. I don't just want to be your business partner. I want to build a life with you, a real one together. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you. I'm saying marry me if you'll have a scarred cowboy who doesn't have much beyond a good horse and a strong back." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you too, you stubborn, brave, wonderful man." He kissed her then, properly this time, pouring everything he felt into it. She responded with equal passion, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless and grinning like fools. "We should probably wait until after the trial," Josephine said practically, even as her fingers tangled in his hair. "Make sure everything's settled first." "Probably wise," Elijah agreed, though he kissed her again because he couldn't resist. The trial began 6 weeks later. Patterson had been arrested without incident, but he'd hired expensive lawyers from San Francisco who did everything they could to discredit the evidence and the witnesses. The courtroom was packed every day, people from Fort Lyon and beyond coming to watch the proceedings. Henry the blacksmith was there, along with his son who'd returned from California to testify. 3 other families Patterson had defrauded came forward with their own stories. Elijah and Josephine both took the stand, walking the jury through everything that had happened. Patterson's lawyers tried to paint Josephine as a bitter woman making up stories, tried to suggest Elijah was a dangerous drifter with a criminal past. But the evidence from Patterson's own safe was damning, and Marshall Grant's testimony about Patterson's pattern of fraud sealed the case. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Thomas Patterson guilty on all counts: fraud, extortion, illegal foreclosure, and a dozen other charges. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in territorial prison and ordered him to make restitution to everyone he defrauded. His business empire was dismantled, his assets seized and distributed among his victims. Walking out of the courthouse, Josephine felt like she could finally breathe. The homestead was hers, truly hers, with no debt hanging over her head. Patterson would never threaten her again. Justice had actually been served. "It's over," she said, leaning against Elijah as they stood on the courthouse steps. "No," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "It's just beginning." They were married 2 days later by a justice of the peace in Denver, with Marshall Grant and his wife serving as witnesses. Josephine wore a simple blue dress bought with some of the restitution money, and Elijah wore new clothes that made him look almost respectable. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the justice pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah kissed his bride with a joy he'd never known existed. They returned to Fort Lyon a week later as Mr. and Mrs. Harmon, ready to begin their life together. The homestead looked exactly as they'd left it, though the garden had gotten overgrown and the barn needed some repairs. They set to work immediately, fixing what needed fixing and planning for the future. True to her word, Josephine expanded the horse business. With Elijah's skills at catching and breaking wild mustangs and her knowledge of training and sales, they quickly built a reputation for quality animals. Within a year, they'd hired 2 hands to help with the work and had purchased an adjacent property to expand their operation. The first winter in their marriage was hard but happy. They worked side by side during the day and fell asleep in each other's arms every night. Elijah learned what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself, to have someone who depended on him and who he could depend on in return. Josephine discovered that partnership didn't mean losing herself, but rather becoming stronger through the bond they shared. In the spring, she told him she was pregnant. Elijah's reaction was pure joy mixed with terror. He'd never thought about being a father, had assumed that path wasn't meant for him. But as Josephine's belly grew through the summer, he found himself imagining the future. Teaching a child to ride, passing on the skills his own father had taught him, building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. Their son was born on a cool October evening in 1879, delivered by a midwife from Fort Lyon with Elijah pacing anxiously outside. When he finally got to hold the baby, wrapped in a quilt Josephine had made during her pregnancy, Elijah cried. He'd thought he'd used up all his tears years ago, but this tiny, perfect human being broke something open inside him. "What should we name him?" Josephine asked, exhausted but radiant. "Samuel," Elijah said without hesitation. "After my father, Samuel Harmon, I like that." They built their family carefully and lovingly. 3 years later, A daughter arrived, and they named her Clara after Josephine's aunt. The children grew up surrounded by horses and hard work, learning early that nothing worthwhile came easy. Elijah proved to be a patient father, teaching them with the same gentle firmness he used to train horses. Josephine was the disciplinarian and the dreamer, always pushing them to be better while making sure they knew they were loved. The horse business flourished. By 1885, Harmon Ranch was known throughout Colorado and beyond for producing quality stock. They bred their own horses now, developing bloodlines that combined endurance with intelligence. The cavalry bought from them regularly, as did ranchers from 3 territories. They'd become wealthy by frontier standards, though they lived simply and put most of their profits back into the land and the business. Elijah never forgot where he'd come from, though. Every year on the anniversary of the day, he'd walked into that general store and met Josephine. He'd ride out to the spot where they'd made their first camp fleeing Fort Lyon. He'd sit there for an hour, remembering how lost he'd been before her, how close he'd come to drifting forever. Then he'd ride home to his wife and children, grateful beyond words for the life they'd built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they hosted a celebration at the ranch. Dozens of people came, friends and business associates and townsfolk from Fort Lyon. Henry the blacksmith was there with his family. Marshall Grant, retired now, made the trip from Denver with his wife. Even some of the families Patterson had defrauded, who'd used their restitution money to rebuild their own lives, came to celebrate. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Elijah and Josephine slipped away to the porch of their cabin. It had been expanded twice now, with additions for the children and a proper kitchen, but the original structure remained, a reminder of where it all began. "You ever regret it?" Josephine asked, settling into the rocking chair that had been her aunt's. "Stopping here instead of moving on." Elijah sat on the porch railing, looking at his wife. She was in her early 30s now, her face showing the effects of hard work and Colorado sun, but to him, she'd never been more beautiful. Not for a single second. "You. Never. You saved me, you know, not just from Patterson, but from a life alone, from giving up. You gave me a partner, a family, a future." She reached out and took his hand. "You gave me everything. You did the same for me, more even. You looked at me and didn't see the scar, you saw the man underneath. That changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of celebration from the yard, watching their children play with the other kids. Samuel was 7 now, tall and serious like his father. Clara was 4, all wild energy in her mother's green eyes. Another baby was on the way, due before Christmas, and Elijah found himself hoping for another girl. The ranch would need strong women to help run it just as much as it needed strong men. "I love you," Josephine said softly. "I love you too. Forever." The years continued to pass, marked by births and seasons and the steady growth of everything they'd built. Samuel grew into a fine young man who shared his father's gift with horses. Clara developed her mother's head for business and started handling sales when she was barely a teenager. The third child, another son they named Benjamin, was the wild one, always getting into trouble and making them laugh. Elijah's scar never faded, but it stopped mattering years ago. The people who knew him saw past it to the good man underneath, the devoted husband and father, the skilled horseman and fair employer. New people might still glance twice when they first met him, but it didn't cut the way it used to. He had Josephine and their children, had a home and a purpose. The scar was just a scar, a mark from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. When Elijah turned 50, Josephine threw him a surprise party. Half of Fort Lyon showed up, along with ranchers from across the territory and buyers from as far away as Texas. They roasted a whole steer and drank whiskey and told stories late into the night. At one point, Elijah stood on the porch, looking out at the crowd of people who'd become his community, his family in all but blood, and felt overwhelming gratitude. This life he'd stumbled into, this love he'd been given, it was more than he'd ever dreamed possible. Samuel married when he was 23, bringing a sweet-natured woman named Margaret to the ranch. They built a house on the northern section of the property and started their own family. Clara waited until she was 25, marrying a banker from Denver who was smart enough to know she was the real power in their partnership. They split their time between the city and the ranch, with Clara managing the business end of operations while her husband handled investments and expansion opportunities. Benjamin, true to form, didn't settle down until he was almost 30. When he finally did, it was with a widow from Fort Lyon who had 3 children of her own. They made an odd but happy family, blending their lives with the same patience and love that had always characterized the Harmons. Elijah and Josephine became grandparents, then great-grandparents as the years rolled on. They watched Harmon Ranch grow into a genuine empire, with operations in 3 states and a reputation that stretched from coast to coast. But it was never about the money or the success. It was about the family they'd created, the legacy they were leaving behind. In the summer of 1910, Elijah fell ill. The doctors said it was his heart, worn out from years of hard living and harder work. He was 72 and Josephine was 68. They'd had 42 years together, a lifetime of love and partnership. As he lay in their bed surrounded by children and grandchildren, Elijah reached for his wife's hand. "No regrets," he whispered. "None at all," she agreed, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me the best life, Elijah Harmon. You gave me everything, Josephine, everything I never knew I needed." He passed quietly that evening with his family around him and his wife's hand in his. At the funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Colorado, Samuel spoke about his father's legacy. Not the ranch or the business, but the man himself. Kind, loyal, brave, devoted. A man who'd been judged by his appearance all his life but had proven that scars didn't define you. Your actions did, and the love you gave and received. Josephine lived another 8 years, staying active in the ranch operations until almost the very end. She was surrounded by family, loved and respected by everyone who knew her. When she finally passed in her sleep in 1918, at the age of 76, the family buried her next to Elijah on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together. The marker was simple. Elijah Harmon, 1838–1910, beloved husband and father. Josephine Harmon, 1850–1918, beloved wife and mother. Together forever. Their children continued the ranch, passing it down through generations. The original cabin was preserved as a family landmark, a reminder of where it all began. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind came down from the mountains just right, people swore they could hear the sound of laughter from that old cabin, the echo of a love story that had started with a chance meeting in a general store and had grown into something that would last forever. The cowboy who'd been marked by violence had found peace in the arms of a woman who saw past his scars. The homesteader who'd faced losing everything had found a partner who'd fight beside her no matter the odds. Together, they'd built something that would endure long after they were gone. A family, a legacy, and proof that even in the harsh reality of the Wild West, true love could not only survive but flourish. Their great-great-grandchildren still run Harmon Ranch today, carrying on traditions that started in 1878 when a scarred cowboy decided to stop drifting, and a brave woman decided to trust him. The business has modernized, but the values remain the same: hard work, fair dealing, and the understanding that family, whether blood or chosen, is what matters most. And every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, someone from the family rides out to that grove of trees where Elijah and Josephine spent their first night fleeing to Denver. They sit quietly for a while, thinking about the courage it took to fight for love and justice, about how two people with nothing but hope and determination changed the course of so many lives. Then they ride home, grateful for the legacy they've inherited and determined to honor it. The story of Elijah and Josephine Harmon became a legend in Fort Lyon and beyond, not because they were famous or particularly remarkable by historical standards, but because they represented something essential: that love can find you in the most unexpected places, that courage comes in many forms, and that the scars we carry, whether physical or emotional, don't have to define us. What defines us is what we choose to do, who we choose to love, and the life we choose to build. Elijah Harmon chose to stop running and plant roots. Josephine Vaughn chose to fight instead of surrender. Together, they chose love, and that choice echoed through generations, shaping lives that hadn't even been imagined yet when they first shook hands in that general store. It's a simple story, really. A man and a woman meeting at the right moment, finding in each other exactly what they needed, and building a life together through hard work and unshakable devotion. But simple doesn't mean insignificant. Sometimes the simplest stories are the ones that matter most, the ones that remind us what's possible when we're brave enough to take a chance on love. And if you ever find yourself in Fort Lyon, Colorado, stop by Harmon Ranch. The family will welcome you, might even show you around if they're not too busy. They'll tell you the story of Elijah and Josephine, of how love triumphed over fear and corruption, and all the obstacles the Wild West could throw at two people who just wanted a chance at happiness. They'll show you the original cabin, preserved and maintained with loving care. They'll take you to that hill where the markers stand, overlooking miles of land that represents not just property but a dream realized. And if you're lucky, they might tell you the family secret passed down through 5 generations. That love isn't something you find. It's something you build day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. Elijah and Josephine knew that. They lived it. And because they did, their story continues, a testament to the power of two people who looked at each other without fear and decided to build something that would last forever.